My name is Leo Vance, and I'm 34. I make my living as a civil engineer here in Denver, Colorado. It's a city with a sharp, modern energy that keeps you on your toes, but it also has these quiet, historic corners that invite you to just stop for a moment and breathe it all in. I live out in the suburbs in a modest apartment, a clean and simple space that's perfect for one person. I'm not the kind of guy who lays his whole life out for inspection, but you asked for my story, so here it is. It's a story that starts with deep fractures inside my own family, a series of wrongs that sent me down a path I never could have imagined. From the outside, anyone would have said my childhood was idyllic, the kind of happy family you see in commercials. My father, Robert Vance, is a retired high school history teacher, a man governed by a set of unbending, old-fashioned principles. He possessed a unique talent for making you feel perpetually inadequate, as if his approval was a prize you could never quite qualify for. My mother, Eleanor, was the classic homemaker, a whirlwind of activity in the kitchen, her care extending to everyone and everything, except, it seemed, to me. Then there was Ethan, my little brother, younger by 4 years. From the day he was born, he was the family's shining star, handled as if he were made of the most fragile crystal. And that left me. I was just Leo, the responsible older son, the one who was supposedly so capable that he didn't require any real attention. My parents assumed I'd always manage on my own. But being the strong one doesn't insulate you from hurt. I can still remember countless nights spent staring at the shadows on my bedroom ceiling, my mind replaying the same question over and over. What did I do to become invisible? I remember being 10 years old when Ethan got a gleaming new bicycle simply because he'd thrown a tantrum for it. My ride to school? It was my dad's old, creaking frame, which I had to de-rust and patch up myself. Years later, when I held my engineering degree, my parents offered a brief, almost obligatory pat on the shoulder. "Good job, Leo," they'd said. "Time to get to work." Meanwhile, Ethan, who had left a trail of spectacularly failed restaurant ventures in his wake, was still lauded as some kind of entrepreneurial visionary. They celebrated his spirit, ignoring the fact that the only things he truly excelled at were burning through their money and blaming others for his mistakes. That constant unfairness was a shard of glass lodged under my skin, a shallow cut, but one that refused to scar over. Just when I thought I'd grown numb to it, it would shift and draw fresh blood. Still, I carried on, pouring myself into my career, always striving to be the son they could finally be proud of, even as a voice in my head told me they would never really see me. The foundation of my life began to crack on a crisp afternoon in October. My phone vibrated sharply against my desk. It was my mother. Her voice came across the line stretched thin and brittle, trembling not with tears, but with a palpable effort to contain some looming anxiety. "Leo, I need you to come over," she said. "We have to talk." I drove through the familiar streets of my youth in Denver, the autumn sun setting the maple trees ablaze in fiery gold and crimson. A cold dread began to coil in my gut, a heavy certainty that something was deeply wrong. The house where I'd spent my childhood stood there, its red brick facade a solid testament to 1,000 memories, but the feeling of home had long since evaporated. It was just a building now. The moment I stepped inside, the silence hit me like a physical force. My mother was at the dining room table, her knuckles white as she systematically tortured a dish towel, wringing it over and over as if it were the one thing anchoring her to the room. My father was opposite her, silent and motionless. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, heavy enough to suffocate. His face was a mask of that all-too-familiar sternness, the same look he gave me when I was a boy about to be disciplined. I felt my own posture stiffen in response. "Leo," My mother began, her voice soft but weighed down with sorrow. This is about Ethan. Of course it is, I thought, a bitter taste rising in my throat. It's always about Ethan. Your brother, he's in trouble, she went on, the words catching in her throat. The restaurants, they're all gone. He's in debt, Leo, a lot of debt. I didn't want to alarm you, but it's very serious. I shifted my weight, leaning against the kitchen counter and crossing my arms. I was bracing myself, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'd been aware for some time that Ethan's business dealings were built on sand, but this felt different. The way my mother refused to meet my gaze, the tight clench of my father's jaw. This wasn't just another failed enterprise. It was a catastrophe. How bad is it? I asked, working to keep my voice even and detached. My father spoke for the first time, his tone clipped and sharp. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, he said. The creditors are closing in. He's going to lose it all. A part of me knew I should be feeling some sort of sympathy for my brother. He was my blood, after all. But what I actually felt was a hot, smoldering rage building in my gut, an inferno fed by a lifetime of being pushed to the side to clear a path for Ethan. So what is it you expect me to do? I asked, my voice coming out harsher than I'd intended. My mother flinched as if I'd struck her. I'm not suggesting you have to solve this, Leo, she said quickly, but we've made a decision. We're going to help him. We're taking out another mortgage on the house. Those words landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The house, the one they had worked their entire lives to own outright. The one asset they swore they would never, ever put at risk. And now they were going to leverage it all to rescue Ethan. To bail out the golden child who had consistently and spectacularly failed at every single thing he'd ever tried. Are you serious? I managed to get out, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You can't be serious. You're going to throw away your entire future to clean up his mess? Again, my father's eyes narrowed into slits. He's your brother, Leo. This is what a family does. We help each other. Family? The word tasted like poison. Where was this family when I was working 2 jobs to put myself through college? Where was this family the one time I actually asked for help? My mother reached a hand toward me, but it stopped mid-air, hovering in the space between us, a perfect symbol of her uncertainty. Leo, please, she pleaded. You've always been so strong. You never needed our help the way Ethan does. That line, it was the story of my life. Strong, independent Leo, the son who required no support. I felt a scream building in my chest, a primal urge to yell that I had needed them, that I had simply learned long ago that asking was pointless. But I didn't. I choked the anger down just like I always did. The fight that erupted after that was ugly. I finally let it all out. Decades of being ignored, of watching Ethan get rescued from one self-inflicted disaster after another while I was left to sink or swim on my own. My father accused me of being selfish, of having no concept of loyalty. My mother just sobbed, begging me to see their side of it, but this time I couldn't. I just couldn't. I had my hand on the cold brass of the doorknob, ready to walk out when my father's voice stopped me. Wait. We're not leaving you with nothing, Leo. There's something for you too. I turned around slowly, fully expecting some other meaningless, hollow gesture. My mother approached and held out a worn manila folder, her hands shaking so badly the papers rattled. The cabin, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's the old place up in the mountains where your grandfather used to live. We're signing the deed over to you. The cabin, a dilapidated shack deep in the Rocky Mountains that had been sitting empty ever since my grandfather, Samuel, had vanished without a trace back in 1972. The absurdity of it all was so immense that I almost started laughing right there in front of them. It was a consolation prize. They were handing me a forgotten, unwanted relic while they mortgaged their entire future on Ethan's latest failure. "You keep it," I said, trying to push the folder back toward her, but my mother pressed it firmly into my hands. "It's yours, Leo," she insisted. "It's all we have left to give you." I walked out of that house. The weight of the folder in my hands, nothing compared to the crushing weight in my chest. I didn't want their charity, their pathetic attempt to balance the scales, and yet something about that cabin, Grandfather Samuel's cabin, lodged itself in my mind. Maybe it was because he was this great unspoken mystery, a name all but erased from our family's history. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because I felt like I had no other place to turn. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of headlights and anger. The familiar streets of Denver swam past, indistinct through a haze of pain. I threw the folder onto my kitchen table, and there it sat for days, a silent challenge daring me to look inside. When I finally did, it was just as I'd imagined. A property deed, a faded photograph of a ramshackle cabin half swallowed by pine trees. There was also a letter from my mother, her looping script filled with apologies I had no interest in reading. But beneath all that, tucked away at the very bottom, was something else. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle and yellow with age. My grandfather Samuel's name was written on the inside cover in faded ink, right next to the year 1972, the year he disappeared. I started flipping through the pages, my fingers tracing over his notes about rock formations, mineral deposits, and hand-drawn maps of the Rocky Mountains. His handwriting was precise, almost obsessive, detailing a search for something he never spoke of to anyone. It was the writing of a man consumed by a secret. I'm not sure why I didn't just toss it aside. Perhaps it was because my grandfather was the only member of my family to whom I'd ever felt any kind of connection, even if it was just through half-remembered stories. He was a geologist, a quiet man who, by all accounts, was more at home in the silent company of mountains than he ever was with people. My mother once told me I was just like him, calm, solitary, and impossibly stubborn. Maybe that was the reason I couldn't just dismiss the cabin. I called my boss and took a week of leave, threw a bag in my truck, and started the drive to the mountains. The Rockies were a world away from Denver, a raw and untamed landscape of jagged peaks that clawed at the clouds. The cabin itself was nestled deep in the wilderness, a forgotten relic that time had left behind. I had no idea what I was searching for. Maybe I wanted answers, or maybe I just needed a place where I could finally breathe, a place where no one expected me to be the strong one. When I finally pulled up, the reality of the cabin was far worse than the photograph had suggested. The roofline drooped like a tired old man, the windows were jagged voids, and the air hung thick with the smell of decay and lost time. But as I pushed open the door and stepped across the threshold, something inside me shifted. This wasn't just a pile of rotting wood. This was Grandfather Samuel's home. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that it held secrets. Secrets that might finally offer me a connection to the family that had always kept me at arm's length. I started to work, tearing out moldy floorboards and sweeping away shattered glass. And that's when I saw it, a single loose plank in the far wall. Behind it, almost hidden in the shadows, was a rusted iron ring. My heart began to hammer against my ribs as I gripped the ring and pulled. With a groan of protest, a section of the floor came free, revealing a hidden trapdoor. A wave of cold, stagnant air washed over me, carrying the heavy scent of decades of undisturbed earth. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the peaks. A few weak, golden rays pierced the gloom of the cabin, illuminating swirling dust motes on the floor. I stood there before the dark opening, flashlight clutched in my hand, a tremor running through me that had nothing to do with the chill. It was a strange, electric feeling, as if I were about to cross a forbidden line. My own breath came out in ragged puffs, mingling with the damp, musty smell of the cellar and the sharp tang of corroded iron. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was nothing more than an old root cellar, probably filled with a few of Grandfather Samuel's forgotten tools and supplies. But a deeper, more primal instinct was screaming at me that whatever was down there, it wasn't going to be simple. I switched on my flashlight, the powerful beam slicing through the darkness like a surgeon's scalpel. The wooden steps leading down were rotten, groaning ominously with every ounce of weight I put on them. I braced myself with one hand against the cold, damp earth of the wall, descending slowly, my pulse throbbing in my ears. When my boots finally touched the packed dirt floor, I swept the beam of light across the space. It was smaller than I'd anticipated, a cramped earthen room with air so heavy and still it felt hard to breathe. But it wasn't the claustrophobic size of the cellar that made me freeze in place. It was what I saw on the floor. Lying at an odd angle were two human skeletons, their bones a shocking, brilliant white in the harsh glare of my flashlight. A cracked hard hat lay on the ground beside one. The other was still partially covered by the tattered remains of a jacket, the fabric stiff with dried mud. A chill shot through me, so profound it felt like my blood had turned to ice. I'm not a man who scares easily, but standing there in that hidden cellar, staring at two skeletons, I couldn't control the shaking in my hands. Taking a deep, ragged breath to steady my nerves, I knelt beside the remains. My light caught the glint of metal nearby. It was an old tin box, its surface mottled with rust. With trembling fingers, I worked at the lid until it screeched open. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like old cloth, was another leather-bound journal, a carefully folded map, and a small, heavy rock that shimmered with a faint, unmistakable golden light. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the notebook steady. The handwriting was unmistakably my grandfather's, but here it was cramped and frantic. The script of a man consumed by a desperate obsession. I thumbed through the pages, my eyes scanning over more notes about geology and mineral formations in the Rockies. But one word appeared over and over again: gold. Not the kind you see in a jewelry store, but raw, pure gold, hidden away in veins that had never been touched by man. I sank back against the cold dirt wall, the flashlight beam illuminating the spidery script. My grandfather wrote of a massive gold deposit, a discovery he believed was so significant it could change the entire region forever. But he hadn't wanted to exploit it. His goal, it seemed, had been to protect it from falling into the hands of illegal miners and opportunists. Toward the end of the journal, his writing became even more agitated, the words practically flying off the page as if he were in a race against an unseen clock. Then one final entry sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. Damien betrayed me. Trust no one. Damien, the name meant nothing to me, but it felt like a key, a crucial piece of the puzzle of my grandfather's disappearance. My gaze drifted back to the two skeletons on the floor. Was one of them my grandfather, and the other? Could it be Damien? What happened down here? Was it a fight over the gold, a terrible accident? Or was it something far more sinister? A storm of questions raged in my mind, but the cellar offered no answers, only the oppressive silence and the bone-deep cold. I have no idea how long I sat there, maybe hours, reading and rereading that journal, trying to make sense of the legacy my grandfather had left behind. When I finally climbed out of the cellar, the world outside was cloaked in darkness. The only light came from the moon, its pale glow filtering weakly through the shattered window panes, casting long, distorted shadows across the cabin floor. I placed the old tin box on the cabin's rickety kitchen table. My eyes were locked on that small, gold-veined rock. It wasn't much bigger than my fist, but its subtle, shimmering light seemed to whisper of secrets buried deep within the earth. I knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that I was holding something of immense value and immense danger. If this gold deposit was real, it gave a terrifying context to my grandfather's disappearance. It provided a motive. It explained why someone might have wanted him silenced forever. I eventually fell asleep right there in a dusty old armchair, the leather journal clutched tightly in my hand. I woke the next morning with a crick in my neck and a mind that wouldn't stop spinning. I had to have answers, but the first step was figuring out who was in that cellar. I drove into Silverton, the closest town, and found the local sheriff's office. I reported my discovery, keeping my voice as level as I could, but inside I felt like I was balanced on a razor's edge. The sheriff, a man in his 50s named Miles, arrived at the cabin around noon. He had the weary, knowing eyes of someone who had seen his share of strange things out in these mountains. I led him and his deputy to the trapdoor, trying to sound detached as I explained what I'd found. Miles studied my face, his gaze sharp and questioning. "You said this was your grandfather's property?" "That's right," I answered. "Samuel Vance. He vanished back in '72. I have a feeling one of them is him." Miles nodded slowly, then directed his team to start documenting the scene. "We'll get forensics out here, run DNA," he told me, his eyes never leaving mine. "But you should prepare yourself. This kind of thing, it can get messy." I wasn't sure exactly what he meant by that, but the way he looked down into that dark hole sent a shiver of apprehension through me. It was as if he already knew a piece of the story that I didn't. For the next few days, I stayed at the cabin, boarding up the windows and patching the roof, making it just habitable enough to sleep in. Every night, I sat with my grandfather's journal, trying to assemble the fractured pieces of his story. He had been working with a partner, a fellow geologist named Damien Croft. They had found the gold deposit together, but at some point their partnership had imploded. The journal was vague on the details, offering only furious, scrawled lines about betrayal and broken trust. My mind raced, conjuring up all kinds of scenarios, a heated argument that turned violent, a struggle for control, or worse, a cold-blooded, calculated plan. I had nothing to go on but a deep, unshakable feeling that the gold was the dark heart of this whole mystery. The call from the sheriff's office came a week later. Miles met me at a little diner in Silverton and slid a thin file across the table toward me. "The DNA results are back," he said, his voice quiet. "It's confirmed. One set of remains belongs to Samuel Vance, your grandfather. The other is Damien Croft, his partner." I nodded slowly. I'd been expecting it, but hearing the words out loud still felt like a physical blow. "What happened to them?" I asked. Miles gave a slight shrug. "It's hard to be certain after all this time. We found evidence of a struggle. Croft's skull has a fracture, but the exact cause of death is inconclusive. Could have been an accident during a fight, or..." He let the sentence hang in the air, watching me closely. "Do you want us to pursue this further?" I paused, a war raging inside me. One part of me desperately needed to know the truth, no matter how ugly. Another part was terrified of what that truth might do, of the old wounds it might tear open. "Yes," I said at last, my voice firm. "Keep going. I have to know." Back at the cabin, I spread the old map from the tin box out on the table. It was drawn by hand with an almost obsessive level of detail, marking a precise location deep in the Rockies, not far from a dried-up creek bed. I'm an engineer, not a geologist, but I know enough about reading topography to see that reaching this spot would be no simple hike. I started packing my gear. I laced up my hiking boots, grabbed a flashlight, a hunting knife, and an old rifle I'd found collecting dust in a corner of the cabin, and set off at dawn. The journey was grueling, a full day of navigating treacherous trails, scrambling over sheer rock faces and pushing through thick, unforgiving pine forests. By the time the sun began to sink behind the jagged peaks, a sharp cold had settled into the air. When I finally found the spot from the map, it was a small, secluded clearing almost perfectly concealed by a cluster of enormous boulders. I dropped to my knees, my breath catching in my throat as I scraped away the topsoil. And there it was. In the dying light of dusk, I saw it, a thick vein of quartz shot through with the unmistakable glint of gold. My heart hammered against my ribs. My grandfather had been telling the truth. The gold was real. I sat back on my heels, a piece of the rock trembling in my hand. In the twilight, its golden flecks seemed to glow with a life of their own, a silent promise and a dire warning all at once. I'm a practical man, not one for fantasies, but in that moment I saw a new path unfurling before me. It wasn't about the money. This was about my grandfather's legacy, something he had died to protect. My mind flashed to the last words in his journal, the accusation of Damien Croft's betrayal, the secrets this mountain had kept for 50 years. I knew then that what I held in my hand was not just valuable, but more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I made my way back to the cabin that night under a canopy of stars, my head swimming with possibilities and plans. If this discovery was as significant as I believed, I had to handle it perfectly. Everything had to be legal, transparent, and by the book. I would not let anyone else steal what my grandfather had found. I might not be a geologist like him, but I am an engineer. I know how to make a plan. I spent the rest of the night hunched over the journal, absorbing every word, studying every hand-drawn diagram. My grandfather had meticulously documented the precise location and composition of the vein, along with detailed notes on the surrounding geological strata. Using my laptop, I cross-referenced the coordinates from his map with publicly available geological survey data for the region. Everything matched. This wasn't some minor pocket of ore. If his calculations were correct, this could be one of the most significant discoveries in this part of the country in half a century. The next morning, I drove back to Silverton and walked into the office of the Colorado Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety. I had the rock sample with me, a copy of the map and a photocopy of the relevant pages from my grandfather's journal. The original notebook was safely locked away in the tin box back at the cabin. The official who met with me, a woman in her 50s named Sarah, regarded me with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and disbelief as I laid out my story. "So you're telling me your grandfather discovered this deposit 50 years ago?" she asked, adjusting her glasses as she leaned forward. "That's right," I said, setting the heavy rock on her desk. "I found his notes and this sample at his old cabin. I'm here to file for the legal mining rights." Sarah picked up the rock, turning it over and over under the bright light of her desk lamp. "This is exceptionally high-grade ore," she said, her tone cautious. "But a claim like this requires extensive geological surveys, more samples, and a mountain of paperwork. It's not a fast process, and this area, it tends to attract a lot of attention." I nodded, understanding her unspoken meaning. She was talking about the major mining corporations that were always circling, looking for any new opportunity to exploit. "I understand completely," I said, "but I'm determined to do this by the book." A small, knowing smile touched her lips as she handed the rock back to me. "Good. I'll dispatch a survey team to verify your claim. If this is what you think it is, it will be a very big deal. But be careful, Leo," she added, her expression turning serious. "Gold has a way of bringing trouble with it." Her warning followed me out of the building and stayed with me all the way back to the cabin. I knew I was walking into a high-stakes game, but I also knew there was no turning back now. This was about more than just wealth. It was about seeing my grandfather's work through to the end, It was about proving once and for all that I was more than just the forgotten older son. The official process of securing the mining rights dragged on for nearly a month. I retained an independent geological survey team to confirm the deposit, and their findings were even better than I had dared to hope. The vein was deep and would be difficult to access, but its potential value was staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars if extracted correctly. The state finally issued me provisional mining rights, but with one major condition. I had to partner with an established company to guarantee all safety and environmental regulations were met. I selected a small Denver-based firm called Alpine Ventures. They had a reputation for being transparent and ethical, and more importantly, they weren't connected to the corporate behemoths like Croft Mining, the company run by Adrian Croft, the man who appeared on my doorstep one afternoon with a look of pure ice in his eyes. I will never forget the day Adrian showed up. He just stood there on my porch, a tall, imposing figure in an expensive black suit, flanked by two men who looked like they could snap me in half without a second thought. "You're digging where you don't belong, Vance," he said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished steel. "My grandfather, Damien, worked with your grandfather. If there's gold in that mountain, half of it belongs to my family." I balled my hands into fists at my sides, fighting to keep my voice steady. "My grandfather wrote that Damien betrayed him," I said. "Whatever gold is up there belongs to my family, not yours." Adrian let out a short, chilling laugh that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You should be careful, Vance," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "You wouldn't want the past to drag you down into that cellar with them." He turned and walked away, leaving me with a cold knot of dread in my stomach. I knew he wasn't making idle threats. Croft Mining was a dominant force in the Rockies with more than enough money and influence to make my life a living hell. But I refused to be intimidated. I wasn't backing down, not now. I pressed forward with the mining project, hiring a skilled team and leasing equipment through Alpine Ventures. We established a base camp near the deposit a few miles deeper into the wilderness from the cabin. I was on site from sunup to sundown, supervising the initial exploratory drilling and sample collection. With each core we pulled, the vein became more defined, its glittering gold-laced rock sending waves of excitement through the crew. But I couldn't share in their enthusiasm. A sense of foreboding clung to me like a shadow. Every night I would lie awake in my tent listening to the wind moaning through the pines, possessed by the unshakable feeling that I was being watched. The trouble began during our third week. I arrived at the site one morning to find our primary drill rig had been sabotaged. The main cables were severed and someone had poured sand into the engine. The crew gathered in small groups, whispering nervously amongst themselves. "Someone doesn't want us here," one of the older miners said, his voice trembling slightly. I searched the perimeter and found what I was looking for. Fresh boot prints that didn't belong to any of my men, and a handful of discarded beer cans from a brand none of us drank. I reported the incident to Sheriff Miles, but when he came out to the site, he just shook his head. "The Rockies are full of troublemakers, Leo," he said. "Could be local kids, could be poachers. There's not enough here to launch a formal investigation." But I knew this wasn't the work of teenagers. This had Adrian Croft's fingerprints all over it. He was trying to scare me off, to make me abandon the claim, but giving up isn't in my nature. I hired additional security guards, had surveillance cameras installed around the camp, and organized the crew into rotating shifts to ensure the site was never left unattended. Adrian, however, was just getting started. A week after that, half of my crew failed to report for their shift. When I tracked them down, they told me they'd received anonymous threatening phone calls. "They said if we don't walk away from this job, our families will be next," one of them told me, his face ashen. I immediately increased their wages and hired more armed security, but the atmosphere at the site had soured. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a tense, nervous energy. Everyone worked with one eye on the forest, as if expecting the shadows themselves to reach out and grab them. The breaking point arrived on a dark, stormy night. I was back at the cabin going over the geological charts one more time when I heard a noise from outside. It was a sharp, metallic crash followed by the crunch of heavy footsteps on gravel. My heart leaped into my throat. I grabbed the old hunting rifle, my hands slick with sweat, and eased the cabin door open just enough to peer out. In the weak, flickering moonlight, I could make out 3 figures standing by my truck. One of them was holding a crowbar, methodically smashing out my headlights. "Hey!" I yelled, stepping out onto the porch and leveling the rifle. "Stop what you're doing, get out of here!" They turned to face me, but they didn't run. The man in the middle, whom I instantly recognized as one of the thugs who had been with Adrian, flashed a cruel smirk. "You should have listened, Vance," he sneered. "Walk away from this mine or the next thing that gets smashed won't be your truck." I fired a warning shot into the air. The deafening crack echoed off the surrounding peaks. That finally sent them scrambling, and they melted back into the dark woods. But the damage was done. When I inspected my truck, I saw that all 4 tires had been slashed. And scrawled across my windshield in what looked like bright red spray paint was a single word: leave. I called Sheriff Miles again, but I wasn't expecting much. I knew Adrian was playing a dirty game, and a man with his resources could easily buy silence and inaction. I had to come up with a new strategy, a way to protect both the mine and myself. The following morning, I took the spare set of keys from my truck, drove into town, and rented a car. I headed straight for Denver with my grandfather's journal and copies of all the key documents. I had managed to get an appointment with Ben Carter, a high-profile attorney who specialized in complex mining disputes. Ben was a man with eyes so sharp they felt like they could see right through you. But he had a calm, reassuring voice that immediately made me feel like I finally had someone in my corner. I laid out the entire story for him, from the moment I arrived at the cabin to the skeletons in the cellar, the discovery of the gold, and Adrian Croft's escalating campaign of sabotage. I pushed the journal across his wide mahogany desk, my finger pointing to the final damning entry about Damien. "This is what I have," I said. "Adrian is doing everything he can to shut me down. I think he's terrified that I'm going to expose the truth about what his grandfather did." Ben picked up the journal, his eyes scanning my grandfather's frantic script. After a few minutes, he leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on the desk. "Leo," he said, his voice dropping to a serious tone, "you are sitting on top of a powder keg. This deposit is real and it's worth a fortune. But you need to understand what you're facing. This isn't just about Adrian. You're going up against an entire system. Croft Mining has deep pockets, political connections, and they will not hesitate to crush you." "So what's my move?" I asked, the cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach again. "Do I just keep working and wait for them to escalate things even further?" Ben offered a thin, tired smile. The smile of a man who had seen far too much of the industry's dark underbelly. "There's a much simpler way to play this, Leo," he said. "Sell the mining rights. Find a large, reputable multinational corporation and sell the entire claim to them. You'll walk away with a fortune, and you won't have to deal with Adrian or his thugs ever again. They wouldn't dare pull these kinds of stunts with a global conglomerate." I just stared at him, frozen. Sell the claim. The idea had never even occurred to me. This gold was my grandfather's legacy, the very thing he had died protecting. Selling it felt like a betrayal, like abandoning his memory. But then my mind replayed the last few weeks, the sleepless nights, the sabotage, the chilling threats that had scared off my crew. I couldn't live in a state of constant fear. And maybe my grandfather wouldn't have wanted me to die for this gold either. You don't have to make a decision right now, Ben said gently as if he could read my thoughts. But consider it. If you hold on to this claim, you're signing up for a war with Adrian Croft. And it's a war he will fight to the bitter end. And I can promise you, he does not play by the rules. If you sell, you walk away from all of this with enough money to completely transform your life. And who knows? Maybe you can use that money to build something worthwhile, something your grandfather would have been proud of. I drove back to the cabin with Ben's words ringing in my ears. Sell the claim. The thought was both a siren song and a punch to the gut. I opened my grandfather's journal again, my eyes falling on one of his last entries. The gold isn't the point. In the hands of the greedy, it is nothing but a curse. Maybe he was right. He never wanted this discovery to be exploited by men like Damien Croft or his grandson. But he wouldn't have wanted me to pay the same price he did either. I stayed up all night pacing the small cabin, weighing my options until the sun came up. If I held on, I was choosing to fight Adrian, to endure more sabotage, and to face dangers that I couldn't even predict. But if I sold, I could put an end to all of it. Not just the threats and the fear, but the long, painful years of being the invisible son. I could finally prove to them and to myself that I never needed their validation. I could forge my own path. The next morning, I called Ben. I'm ready, I said, my voice surprisingly firm. Find me a buyer. I want to sell the claim. Ben didn't sound surprised at all. Good choice. I already have a company in mind. They're called Apex Minerals, a major international firm out of Canada. They've been looking to expand their operations in the US. I'll set up a meeting. But Leo, get ready. This is going to be a massive deal. Things moved with incredible speed after that. Ben reached out to Apex, and within a week they had dispatched a team of their top geologists to the Rockies to conduct their own survey. I led them up to the remote clearing where the vein of gold-laced quartz lay waiting. The Apex team went to work with a quiet, methodical precision that I found deeply reassuring, taking their own samples, running their own tests, and verifying every detail of my grandfather's notes. They confirmed what my own team had already told me. The deposit was a king's ransom with enough reserves to support a major mining operation for decades. Of course, Adrian didn't just sit back and watch. He must have heard about Apex's visit through his network of sources in Silverton. One afternoon, as I was overseeing the Apex team, his signature black SUV came roaring up the trail. He got out dressed in his usual expensive suit, but this time his eyes were blazing with a barely contained fury. "You think you can just sell this out from under me and walk away, Vance?" he snarled, stalking toward me. "The Crofts have a legitimate claim to that gold." "My grandfather died because of it," I shot back, standing my ground. "And your grandfather betrayed him, Adrian. If you think you have a claim, then sue me. But I'm telling you right now, I have proof. I have my grandfather's journal. And it tells the whole story." Adrian's hands clenched into tight fists, but he didn't come any closer. Maybe he finally realized that Apex Minerals was not an opponent he could bully into submission. He held my gaze for a long, tense moment, then spun on his heel and stalked back to his vehicle. "You're going to regret this, Vance," he threw back over his shoulder. But I didn't regret it. Not for a second. The final negotiations with Apex Minerals took place in a high-rise office building in downtown Denver. I sat across a massive conference table from their CEO, a distinguished older man named David with a full head of silver hair and a calm, direct manner. He slid a thick contract across the polished wood toward me. "Our final valuation of your claim is $45 million, he said. "You'll receive that amount in full plus a 5% equity stake in the mining operation itself. If the mine produces as we expect it to, Your shares could become significantly more valuable over time. I reached for the pen, my hand shaking just a little. $45 million. It was a number so large I could barely comprehend it. But in that moment, it wasn't the money that filled my thoughts. It was the realization that I had finally finished what my grandfather had started. I signed my name, the ink flowing smoothly from the pen. And when I stood up and shook David's hand, I felt a burden I hadn't even realized I was carrying simply lift off my shoulders. I was free. Free from Adrian, free from the sleepless nights, and most importantly, free from the long, dark shadow of my family. After the deal was finalized, Adrian Croft seemed to disappear from my life completely. He must have known he stood no chance in a legal battle against a company like Apex. The sabotage stopped and Apex's crews began full-scale mining operations at the site. I went back to Denver with a fortune in my bank account and a sense of liberation I had never experienced before. But even with all of that, I could still hear my grandfather's voice whispering to me from the brittle pages of his journal. I knew I hadn't just sold a mining claim. I had traded a piece of my family's painful past for a chance to build my own future. I returned to my life in Denver with $45 million from Apex Minerals and a 5% stake in the mine. The number was so absurdly large that I would sometimes catch myself staring at my bank statement just to make sure it was real. Suddenly, my modest suburban apartment felt confining, not because it was small, but because it belonged to a man I no longer was. I started looking at real estate listings, dreaming of a house with a view of the mountains, a place where I could sit in peace and think about Grandfather Samuel, the man who had given me this second chance, even though he wasn't here to see it. But news of a fortune, much like the gold itself, is impossible to keep hidden for long. Within a few weeks of the deal closing, the local papers started picking up the story. Denver engineer discovers massive gold deposit in Rockies. One headline blared. The article told a sensationalized version of my story, painting me as some kind of adventurous hero who had single-handedly uncovered his family's lost legacy. They called me a visionary, but all I felt like was a tired engineer who had tried to do the right thing. I never expected the story to get so much attention. But it didn't stop with the local news. Social media lit up, with my name and story being shared everywhere, from local community pages to international mining forums. One morning I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking my coffee and scrolling through my emails when my phone started vibrating nonstop. It was an endless stream of messages from old friends, former colleagues, even people I'd never met, all congratulating me. But one message made me stop cold. It was from my mother. "Leo, we saw the news about the gold. Please, can you come over? We need to talk. We are so proud of you." I just stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold in my mug. Proud? When had my parents ever used that word in a sentence that included my name? A familiar, painful ache stirred deep in my chest, the ghost of an old wound that had never properly healed. I didn't answer her. Instead, I put my phone down, stood up, and walked out onto my small balcony. The cool Denver air washed over me, carrying with it a flood of memories of being constantly pushed aside while Ethan, my golden boy younger brother, soaked up all the attention. 3 days later, I found myself driving back to that red brick house in the suburbs. It looked the same as it always had, but now it felt like a relic from another lifetime. I didn't want to be there, didn't want to face them, but some small part of me was morbidly curious. I had to hear what they would say to me now, after all this time. My mother answered the door, a fragile, uncertain smile on her face. It was as if she was half expecting me to turn around and leave without a word. "Leo," she said softly, "come in. We've been waiting for you." My father was in his usual armchair, a newspaper folded neatly in his lap. But his eyes, which had always been so sharp and critical, now held a look of caution, a look I had never seen him direct at me before. And then I saw him. Ethan was standing in the corner of the living room, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the floor. He looked even worse than the last time I'd seen him. His hair was a mess, and he was wearing a cheap, wrinkled suit that hung on his frame. The collapse of his restaurant empire had clearly taken its toll. "Sit down, Leo," my mother said, gesturing toward the sofa. I sat, but I didn't lean back. I knew this wasn't a social call. My father was the first to speak, his words coming out slowly as if he were carefully choosing each one. "We saw the news about the gold," he said. $45 million. That's an incredible amount of money, Leo. You've done very well for yourself." I just nodded, my eyes locked on his, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I knew it was coming. My mother picked up the thread, her voice soft and pleading. "You know, this family has been through so much lately," she said. "Especially your brother. Ethan is still trying to recover from everything that happened with the restaurants. We were hoping maybe you could help him." I felt a hot flush of anger rise up my neck, but I forced my voice to remain calm. "Help him? What exactly do you mean?" Ethan finally lifted his head, a desperate flicker of hope in his eyes. "Leo," he said, his voice raspy, "I know you have every right to be angry with me, but I'm trying to make a fresh start. A small loan. Just a little something to get me back on my feet. It would change everything for me." I laughed. It wasn't a sound of amusement, it was a sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief. "A small loan," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Ethan, you drove an entire restaurant chain into the ground. Mom and Dad had to remortgage this house to save you. And now you want a piece of the money that I almost died for?" My mother reached a hand toward me, her expression pained. "Leo, please don't be like that. We're your family. You've accomplished something amazing, and we just want to be a part of it." "A part of it?" I was on my feet now, the years of repressed anger finally boiling over. "When have you ever wanted me to be a part of anything? Where was this family when I was working 2 jobs to put myself through school? Where was this family when all I needed was one single word of encouragement? All I ever heard was, 'Leo's the strong one. Leo can handle it.' And now that I finally have something that's mine, you want me to share it?" My father slammed his hand down on the arm of his chair, his voice cracking like a whip. "That is enough, Leo. How can you be so selfish? You seem to be forgetting that the cabin was family property. What you found there you owe to your brother as well." I looked from my father to my mother and then to Ethan. They just sat there, their faces a mixture of entitlement and expectation, as if my compliance was a foregone conclusion. But I wasn't that dutiful older son anymore. "I'm not sharing it with anyone," I said, my voice low and steady. "That gold belonged to Grandfather Samuel, not this family. And I sold the claim to protect it from people who would have stolen it. If you need money, why don't you ask Ethan how much of this family's fortune he's already set on fire?" Ethan lunged at me, his face contorted with rage. "You have no right to talk to me like that. You think you're better than us now just because you stumbled onto some gold?" I met his gaze without flinching. "No, Ethan, I don't think I'm better than you. I'm just done cleaning up your messes." My mother began to sob, but for the first time in my life, her tears had no effect on me. I turned my back on all of them and walked out, leaving them stewing in a thick, suffocating silence. As I started my car, I saw my father standing in the doorway watching me drive away. He didn't say a word as I pulled away from that red brick house. My heart felt both heavy and strangely buoyant. For the first time in my 34 years, I was free from the crushing weight of my family's expectations. no longer trapped in the role of the responsible older son. The $45 million from Apex and my 5% stake in the mine had bought me something I'd never truly known: independence. The freedom to build a life on my own terms, not one dictated by the needs of my parents or the failures of my brother. Back in Denver, I started to put the pieces of my new life together. The first thing I did was move out of that cramped apartment. I found a beautiful, spacious house on the outskirts of the city with huge windows that looked out over the rolling foothills of the Rockies. The house had a large backyard, and I planted a small grove of aspen trees, their leaves reminding me of the golden light of that first day at the cabin. Every morning I would stand on the deck with my coffee, breathe in the crisp mountain air, and remind myself that this was a new beginning. Next, I got rid of my old beat-up truck. I'd been driving it for years, and its worn-out seats and the faint, persistent smell of motor oil were reminders of a life I was leaving behind. I walked into a dealership and bought a brand-new, top-of-the-line SUV, the kind of vehicle I used to think only existed in movies. As I sat behind the wheel, the smell of new leather filling my senses, I couldn't help but smile. Not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because for the first time I was allowing myself to simply enjoy the fruits of my labor. I also resigned from my engineering firm. My supervisor, Mr. Henderson, looked at me like I had just grown a second head. "Leo, are you serious?" he asked, his eyebrows shooting up to his hairline. "You're one of the best engineers we have." "I'm sure," I replied, my voice calm and steady. "I've worked hard my whole life. Now it's time to live." With the money from Apex and the steady income from my shares in the mine, I knew I would never have to work another day if I didn't want to. I could live more than comfortably for the rest of my life. I started to buy things not out of a need for extravagance, but simply because I could. Things I had always wanted but had never allowed myself to dream of owning. A real leather sofa for my new living room, a massive television for watching football on Sundays. I even booked a trip. For the first time in my life, I left the country. I went to Italy. I walked the ancient cobblestone streets of Florence, lingered for hours in quiet cafes in Rome, and watched the sun set over the cliffs of the Amalfi Coast. Over there, no one knew me as Leo Vance, the man who found the gold mine, or the forgotten son. I was just a 34-year-old man, finally enjoying the life he had earned. But no matter where I went, or what I bought or what I did, I couldn't shake a persistent feeling of emptiness. It wasn't a sharp pain, just a dull, nagging sense that something important was missing. Something I couldn't quite name. At first, I wrote it off as a lingering side effect of the stress and trauma of the last few months, or maybe just the simple fact that I wasn't used to having so much unstructured time on my hands. I tried to fill that void with more travel and more new experiences, but it remained a low, smoldering ache deep inside me. 2 years went by in a flash. My 5% stake in the mine began to generate a steady, significant income. Every month, a substantial sum of money was deposited into my account, far more than I could ever possibly spend. Apex Minerals managed the mine with ruthless efficiency, and the value of my shares skyrocketed, eventually surpassing $100 million. I was no longer the quiet engineer from the suburbs. I was a bona fide multi-millionaire, the Denver gold baron that the local media still sometimes mentioned in their puff pieces. But the title brought me no joy. In fact, it only seemed to make me feel more and more disconnected from the man I used to be. My family hadn't contacted me once since our last explosive confrontation. Not a single text from my mother. Not one phone call from my father. Not even an angry, accusatory email from Ethan. Their silence should have been a blessing, but instead it only seemed to carve out an even bigger hole inside me. I began to understand that for all the pain they had caused me, For all the years of blatant favoritism, they were still my family. They were the only people on earth who had known me my entire life, who knew who I was before the gold changed everything. One night, I was sitting alone in my huge living room watching an old movie on my giant television. There was a scene where a dragon was sleeping on a massive pile of gold, his eyes gleaming with avarice. The image stopped me cold. The dragon was powerful, wealthy beyond measure, and completely and utterly alone, a prisoner of his own treasure. The metaphor hit me with the force of a physical blow. I looked around at my beautiful, expensive, and empty house. There was no laughter here, no family dinners, no one to share any of it with. I finally understood what my grandfather had been trying to say in his journal. I was becoming the very thing he had warned against, a man corrupted by his own wealth, rich in possessions but starving for any real human connection. I switched off the television and walked out onto the deck. The lights of Denver twinkled in the distance, but for the first time the view brought me no comfort. I thought about my grandfather, about the choice he had made to protect the gold rather than exploit it. He hadn't wanted the gold to destroy him or anyone else. But what about me? I had sold the claim and I had used the money to build a new life for myself, but what had I lost in the process? A broken family? A piece of my own soul? I knew then that I had to make a change, not just for my own sake, but for my grandfather's. For the lessons he had tried to teach me from beyond the grave. I didn't want to be that dragon, jealously guarding a pile of treasure in an empty cave. I wanted a life of meaning, a life that my grandfather would have been proud of. And the first step I knew was to reach out to my family. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen for a long moment before I finally pressed the button. I called my mother. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up, her voice shaky, as if she couldn't quite believe it was me on the other end. "Leo?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom," I answered, my own voice just as unsteady. "I think we need to talk." It wasn't an easy conversation. I didn't take back anything I had said during our last meeting, but I told her that I wanted to try to fix things. My mother wept, and my father got on the line, his voice softer and more subdued than I had ever heard it. They told me that Ethan was finally trying to get his life together, that he was working at a local coffee shop, trying to pay back some of what he owed. I didn't offer to just hand them a blank check, but I told them I would help. Not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to. I started to support my family again, but this time it was on my terms. I gave Ethan enough money to clear his debts, but only on the condition that he enroll in and complete a financial literacy program. I also paid off the rest of the mortgage on my parents' house, so they would never have to worry about their financial security again. They thanked me, of course, but I knew that money alone couldn't heal the deep fractures in our family. That was going to take time, and for the first time I was willing to be patient. Then I started working on something bigger, something that would be a true legacy, not just for my family, but for the whole community. I established the Samuel Vance Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to geological education and environmental conservation in the Rockies. I wanted future generations to understand that the Earth's resources weren't just a source of wealth. They were a profound responsibility. I also funded the construction of a new community center in Silverton, a place where local kids could learn about science, about the mountains that surrounded them, and about people like my grandfather who had sacrificed so much for what they believed in. In the autumn of 2024, I stood on the steps of the brand new Samuel Vance Community Center in Silverton, watching as people streamed in and out. A group of children were laughing and chasing each other around the courtyard, clambering over a series of miniature rock formations while their teacher showed them how to identify different types of minerals. As I stood there, I overheard a little girl ask her teacher, "Who was Samuel Vance?" The teacher smiled and pointed to the large bronze plaque by the entrance that bore my grandfather's name. "He was a man who discovered a great treasure," she said, "but he chose to protect it instead of keeping it all for himself." I stood there for a long time, my hands in my pockets, a quiet sense of pride swelling in my chest. Not pride in the money or the recognition, but pride in the fact that I had managed to take my grandfather's dream and make it real. His journal, once a dark secret buried in a cold, forgotten cellar, was now a source of inspiration for a new generation. I think he would have smiled if he could have seen it. That quiet, knowing smile my mother used to describe, the smile of a man who was at peace with the choices he had made. But my grandfather's legacy wasn't just in the buildings and the foundations, it was in me. It was in the way I had learned to live again, to forgive, and to love. My life had been completely transformed from the moment I signed that contract, and now it was more full and vibrant than I had ever thought possible. Reconnecting with my family was a slow and sometimes difficult process. After that first phone call, I started making regular trips back to that red brick house. At first, our visits were strained and awkward, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. My mother tried to bridge the gap by cooking all of my childhood favorites, like the beef stew she used to make for me on my birthday, even though she'd never once asked me if I actually liked it. My father was still quiet, but I noticed that he started to ask me questions about my life, about the community center, with a genuine curiosity I had never seen from him before. Ethan was the hardest one to reach. He still had a bit of that old swagger, but I could see that he was making a real effort to change. After he completed the financial management course I'd insisted on, he opened a small independent coffee shop in downtown Denver. It was nothing like the flashy, over-the-top restaurants he used to run, but it was his, and it was enough for him to finally stand on his own 2 feet. One afternoon I stopped in, and as he was pouring my coffee, he looked up at me and said, his voice hesitant, "Leo, thanks for not giving up on me." I just nodded and took a sip of the coffee. It was surprisingly good. "Just keep doing what you're doing, Ethan," I said. "That's all the thanks I need." Slowly but surely, those Sunday dinners at my parents' house became a regular part of my life again. They were never loud or boisterous, but they had a quiet warmth that I had craved for as long as I could remember. One evening, as we were eating my mother's roast chicken, my father suddenly put his fork down and looked at me, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion, I'm sorry for not seeing you, for not appreciating all that you accomplished on your own. We were wrong to just assume that you were always okay. You've made us very proud." I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. My mother reached under the table and squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You are our greatest treasure, Leo," she said softly. I smiled. Not the polite, empty smile I had worn for so many years, but a real one that reached all the way to my eyes. "Thanks, Mom," I said, and for the first time since I was a small boy, I felt like I was finally home. My life today is more full than I ever could have imagined. I'm no longer that driven, lonely engineer working himself to the bone to try to earn his family's approval. I travel a lot, not just for pleasure, but for purpose. I went to Alaska and stood in awe before massive calving glaciers. I went to Costa Rica and volunteered with a rainforest conservation project. Every trip teaches me something new about the world, about other people, and about myself. Here in Denver, I've become more involved in the community, funding programs at local schools and hosting geology workshops for kids. The Samuel Vance Center in Silverton has become a huge success, and I've started to lay the groundwork for similar centers in other cities. I want every kid to have the chance to learn that science isn't just about what you read in a textbook. It's about real stories of courage, sacrifice, and our shared responsibility to the planet. The money from my shares in the mine still comes in every month, but I'm no longer defined by it. I've learned that gold, no matter how valuable, can't fill the empty spaces in your heart. What truly brings me joy are the small, simple moments. A quiet dinner with my family, the sound of children laughing at the community center, a peaceful morning spent on my deck watching the sun come up over the mountains as I write these words. If you were to ask me what I've learned from all of this, I would tell you that life is a search for meaning, not for treasure. For a long time, I believed that the gold mine was the solution to all of my problems, but I see now that it was only ever a tool. What matters is what you do with the tools you're given, whether you use them to build, to heal, or to destroy. My advice to anyone reading this is simple. Follow your heart. Don't let greed or ambition blind you to what's truly important. Cherish the people in your life, even with all their imperfections. My family caused me a great deal of pain, but I learned to forgive them. Not because they had earned it, but because I no longer wanted to carry the burden of all that resentment. And finally, find a purpose that is bigger than yourself. For me, that purpose is the Samuel Vance Foundation and the generations of kids who will grow up dreaming of making a difference in the world just like my grandfather did. And last but not least, remember that you don't have to be the strong one all the time. Sometimes the greatest strength of all is admitting that you need help. I'm standing on the deck of my house now, watching the sun dip below the peaks of the Rockies, its golden light spilling across the landscape. My grandfather's voice is no longer a warning, it's a benediction, a quiet reminder that I have finally found my way, a path filled with purpose, with meaning, and with love.